Shall we kick off our meeting? Well, welcome everyone to the SOPA webinar today. I'm Lulu Chen, your moderator from Bloomberg. And as part of the SOPA 2022 awards winners, today we're talking to those who were honored in excellence in reporting breaking news. This panel will be recorded and will be made available later on SOPA's Asia YouTube channel. And please submit any questions you have in the Q&A box and we can answer them towards the end of the discussion. This year we saw our winners covering topics from COVID to the Zhengzhou floods to Afghanistan and the shuttering of Apple Daily. And we're here to understand the challenges that these journalists faced in reporting these stories and what valuable lessons and takeaways they had from the experience. So to start out, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. They include Wall Street Journal's Margherita Stancati, who covered the desperate scene to flee Afghanistan as the Taliban took over, Initium Media's Lee Wai Kwan, who documented the last night before Apple Daily shut down, and Six Tone's Yuan Ye, who was among a group of reporters who helped shed light on what happened during the floods in Zhengzhou. And last but not least, Tsao Fu-Nien, who is from The Reporter and was on the front lines to report what it was like during the COVID pandemic peak in Taiwan. I'll have questions for all four of the panelists individually and then bring in some common themes I see for all four people to discuss. And I'll start out with Margherita. So when you were reporting on the story about Afghanistan, what do you think was the biggest challenge when you were trying to cover such a fast-paced story?
So I think on that day, I think the biggest challenge was that, covering the news was only our second priority. Our first priority was making sure that our colleagues were safe. I was not in Kabul physically at the time. My colleague Yaroslav was, and so was all our Afghan staff, our reporters and support staff that had been, many of whom had been with us for years. So, at that moment on August 15th, the country was collapsing to the Taliban, and we really didn't know what was going to happen next, and we didn't know for how long the window to leave the country would be. So, Yaroslav, who was the main writer in the story, in his datelines as Kabul, but he was really in Kabul airport, and there was complete chaos in Kabul airport. It was not clear who was going to be able to leave. The danger was not just the Taliban. At the time, we didn't know how they would behave towards foreigners in the city, but it was also just like, kind of the mob rule of the city. The airport was being completely overrun. So I would say the biggest challenge was reporting while having another priority, which was to make sure everyone was safe. And, in Yaroslav's case, that he got out safely, and he was stuck in the airport for most of the day. So I think that was probably our biggest worry. And of course we had, in our years in Afghanistan prior to that, we had a wide network of people we knew, and also, Afghan reporters, and suddenly there was no one. We were just kind of basically on our own trying to report with very limited visibility on what was happening outside the airport, because our only kind of foreign reporter in Afghanistan was Yaroslav, and he was stuck in the airport. So we were trying to figure out what was happening elsewhere while not being there ourselves. But of course, having Yaroslav there gave us a unique window in how the events were unfolding at the center of the crisis, which was Kabul airport at the time.
As you mentioned, Margherita, so your colleagues are on the front lines, you're stringing in material from a different bureau. What was it like working with other reporters on a breaking news story like this with cross-bureau collaboration?
Yeah, so like the first call I got that day from Yaroslav was, again, it was not for reporting purpose. It was like he was having trouble reaching the airport. So he was asking me, like, please call the Italian embassy. He's an Italian citizen, to help me get to the airport. After we got past that, although we were physically in different places, the one thing that Yaroslav, Diane, and I had in common is that all three of us had lived in Afghanistan, and all three of us had worked together in Afghanistan as well. So we were able to, we knew each other well, we knew how we could help each other. And also we had our own networks of people we could talk to and turn to in a situation of, complete chaos, like Afghanistan. At the time, I was actually on maternity leave. So I was not in the best position to jump on a news story. I was without childcare, I had to kind of find kind of my mother and my husband to kind of help and keep the children. And I just started working the phones, trying to find out as much as I could through personal contacts. I mean, my focus at the time was to talk to people who are not in the airport. Yaroslav was in the airport. He was taking care of, but that's the story. So just finding people who were trying to leave the country, who had just made it out, and talking to them about their experiences and what they were going through. And of course, it was very worrying because we were getting early indications that although in Kabul there was not very much, it was a relatively kind of peaceful takeover. There wasn't a lot of violence. We were beginning to already on that day get some indication that what intimidation was beginning, particularly against Afghans who had links to foreigners, especially to foreign embassies or foreign governments. So trying to kind of piece what was happening in a situation of complete chaos, but was difficult. But at the same time, we were able to rely on our networks and our knowledge of the country. And of course, we knew how the others worked, and we knew each other very well. So that definitely helped a lot.
Yeah, I think it really helped that all three of you worked in the same bureau before, and then also you already knew each other, so there was a lot of synergy already. And talk about dedication, covering this story on maternity leave. I'm moving on to Tsao Fu-Nien, your story about the COVID pandemic in Taiwan. Obviously, there were so many things that you could have covered out of this topic, but you focused on medical ethics. I'm curious to know why you zoomed in on this issue specifically.
Okay, thank you, Lulu. And actually, before this news feature, the reporter had already covered issues about evacuation of nationals, vaccine, distance education, the COVID-19 effect on mental health, and so on. And the pandemic in Taiwan happened a year after the outbreak of COVID-19. But sadly, the government wasn't well prepared for it. And we noticed a post on Facebook from a doctor who worked in a public hospital in Taipei, and realized that although the officials keep saying the hospital had enough beds for COVID patients, but the truth was that those medical workers at the front line faced a shortage of manpower and facilities, and the wards were overcrowded with patients, and doctors faced the tough decision of which patients should stay first. And some of them even were assigned to ask the COVID patient whether to sign the DNR, which means do not resuscitation. And since the ventilator was not enough, and of course, a lot of people didn't have the chance to say goodbye to their loved ones. And since Taiwan had never formulated an ethical recommendation for such an extreme condition, and we believe it was a time to start a discussion and try to convey the struggles of frontline workers, as well as the psychological consequences on medical staff, patients and their family members, and try to discover whether there are ways to ease the damage.
This issue of whether to resuscitate patients is highly technical and controversial. So I was hoping you could help me understand a bit how you prepared to do the reporting and get yourself into, I guess, a neutral mindset in reporting the story.
Because at first we just saw the few posts about doctors who face the ethical dilemma at the front line. Therefore, I think the crucial part of this issue was to make clear that whether it was a special case or had already become a widespread phenomenon in hospitals, and was that true that the medical resources were so limited. So because at the time, only the patients and their family members were allowed to enter the hospital. So that we approach medical staff who post similar stories on social media like Facebook and so on. And some interviewees introduce other healthcare workers to us. So we got a bigger picture about what was going on both public and private hospitals. And some interviewees provide us more details and data and the specific interaction and situations, and to help us make the article exact and reliable. Except for the opinions toward the frontline medical workers, we also interview medical associations about how to make ethical judgments while facing extreme medical conditions. And we also consulted Dr. Marco Vergano, an Italian doctor who faced a similar ethical dilemma. at the beginning of the outbreak. And he also gave Taiwan advices based on Italy's previous experiences. And I think the most important thing is we didn't make any judgment on whether the medical workers should save lives or not, but just reflect the personal dilemma we saw and call for the ethical guideline that the frontline medical workers can rely on, and therefore they don't have to face those difficult positions.
Your point about being sure that this wasn't just a few standout incidents, but more of a systemic issue, I think is really important. So for Lee Wai Kwan, I have a similar question for you. The shuttering of Apple Daily was a really emotional event, not only for the staff there, but also many people in the city. Can you tell us what it was like preparing for reporting on the front lines that night, and how did you prepare your mindset?
Thanks, Lulu. I think it's quite hard to maintain the balance because the shutting down of Apple Daily is very terrifying, not only for the staff, but also reporters all over Hong Kong and also the readers. But I think it is vital to keep distance while reporting. And so we are very bear in mind that we are documenting a fall of an iconic paper, which has its good and has its bad too. And so we do not avoid asking our interviewees how they perceive these different comments on Apple Daily. And we believe it can be a good documentary if we only know how to praise the paper. And so it is also quite important to control our emotions because, you know, people who suffered, our friends in the field, our former colleagues, our journalism teacher and university classmates. And during our work, we have to remind ourselves to keep a fair distance, but also a heart that can feel how they are processing the whole incident. And that's remind me maybe how my editor believed in reporting. It is in Chinese, but the meaning is when you interview, you must be passionate and sensitive, but when you write, you have to be calm. And so I can have some sharing about in the front line. In the building of Next Digital, citizens who support the media are holding some slogans and flowers, and some of them shout thank you to the staff who are still wandering on the rooftop. And I saw the staff from far away shaking their phones with the flash lighting to respond to the public. And I also went to the newspaper store in Mongkok, and I met many people who wait for the last newspapers until dawn. And I think it's a really beautiful and sad scene simultaneously. And at that time, I knew after I finished the article, then it's time for me to process my feelings. Yeah.
The point about being passionate on the front lines while reporting and maintaining your cool when you write the story. So in the process of writing or constructing the narrative, how did you and your editors arrive at this decision to document the last night, and how did you construct the narrative for your story?
Okay. As you know, that the signals of shutting down of Apple Daily happened long ago. I think from start of August 2020. At that time, we have already published an article interviewing several reporters of Hong Kong Apple Daily and also Taiwan Apple Daily soon after the police arrested Lai Chiying and also other senior staffs of Apple Daily. We have been preparing for the news updates, especially aware of the financial condition of Apple Daily, because once they have a financial crisis, then we knew that the media is going to shut down soon. And so around, I think, 2021, April, lots of rumors and news start around that time. And officially, Next Digital had their staff meeting in May, declaring that they won't shut down in advance. But we can hear much news from the Apple Daily reporters. So we started to plan on an article, and we invited the staff and the former staff to record their memory about Apple Daily. And by the time we already decided to prepare feature writing for the last night, and it is different from before, obviously. It is an important timing to capture how the staff think of about the real closure, the unemployment for tomorrow and how to react, and how will they work for the last newspaper under such an pressure and then such a historical moment, and moreover, how will the public respond? So at that time, how we construct the article, I think we believe that there is more than the reporters. The thing is more than the reporters. So we start to find Apple Daily's readers and also the newspaper sellers. The shutting down of the media not only affect the staff, but also the readers, because for a whole 26 years, I think the newspaper do shape how Hong Kong people perceive the society and how they think about the government policy. And it is really meaningful to look into the feelings of the newspaper sellers too, because they witness the media landscape throughout the year. So for us, it's more value added to construct the article in a larger circle.
So the story, even though it took, the focus was for a few hours, but actually the preparation work lasted for more than a year almost.
Yeah.
And I'd like to move on to Yuan Ye. Tell us what it was like reporting the Zhengzhou flood story, which actually happened in a very short span of time. And I'm most curious on how you were able to find the people to talk to in such a short span. I think you're on mute.
Yeah. Okay now?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Lulu. I think when the news started circulating online last year, we had a discussion within our team first and decided to go to Zhengzhou as soon as possible, well as they can. So on our way there, we started to collect information to our personal contacts and piece together the important points and locations that we can still add value. So,
could you move your microphone a little bit closer? Volume's a bit low.
Can you hear clearly now?
A little bit better.
Okay. So, I was saying that when the news started circulating online last year, so we went directly to Zhengzhou while we still can, because, we have to move fast when such a breaking news happened. So we started to collect information during our way there through our personal contacts and trying to piece together the important locations that we can still add value. So when we arrive, and things get a lot easier because you just go to where things happened and talk to people and ask them what happened, what did they say. So there will be a lot of legwork involved because you want to collect information as much as possible. So I think that's how we managed to find the people and the story.
It's amazing that you were able to act so fast, and given the sensitivity of the story and censorship of information, what was it like trying to get people to talk to you, especially on matters of questionable figures for missing people?
Yeah, that's true. As you see that we are mainline in media, so you can imagine there are constraints and limits. I will say it's more of a race against time. So much of the tension about the Zhengzhou flood was in the first place, it was on a flooded subway in which hundreds of passengers were trapped in water. So by the time when we arrived in the city, there were a lot of people that have been rescued, but we didn't know whether they were that we didn't know if that was the whole story because the train was still underwater, and so we went directly to the metro station in which the subway was stopped, and we met a woman there looking for her missing husband. So we stayed there for a few days longer and trying to talk to more witnesses and see if there's more updates. And so that's so we just stayed there and trying to collect information. That's how we find that there that's basically how we found our story, because the woman herself she's a witness that there are more people missing, but the government didn't account them in official tally.
So in this case, being on the ground and doing all that shoe leather reporting is really essential. I have a question for all four of you, because one thing that has emerged from all of these stories seem to be that the subjects of your interviews were all experiencing very traumatic events. What is your takeaway with dealing with such traumatic situations? Any volunteers who would like to take a crack first? Fu-Nien, do you want to go first?
Okay. Yeah, our interviewees were all faced high pressure and a traumatic situation. We listened to them, disappointment and powerless. By the article, we try to come up some ways to support them to release stress. But however, as a journalist, in 2021, except for the pandemic, I also cover stories from other traumatic events, including like a serious train derailment and the building fire with many casualties and so on. And while reporting those disasters, I will try to stay calm as much as possible to avoid being affected by the extremely sad atmosphere on the spot or the emotional breakdown after the interviewees. And I always remind myself that the purpose of being here is to accurately convey the interviewees' voices, not being influenced by those emotions. But I have to say that the reporters are also human beings. I have to admit that I will still have a psychological burden when immersed in those stories. And some issues will also remind me of personal losses in my life sometimes. Therefore, I will try to keep calm during the interview and do the recording if the interviewee agree with it, to prevent missing details when the scene is so chaotic or emotional. And after the interview, I know some reporters will start writing the article immediately, but if possible, I will take a short break, such as a long walk back to the hotel or the train station. And during that time, I will let myself space out, slightly detach from emotions and pressure from the scene, and recall the content that impressed me most, and set up the draft in my brand. As for me, setting up an emotional breakpoint can help me more rational and maintain my role as a journalist. And furthermore, my company also provides psychological counseling resources for them.
Kwan Lee, I see you agreeing with Fu-Nien there. Did you have any similar takeaways, including setting up emotional breakers and taking a breather from the reporting?
Yeah, I think it's always important to do follow-up interviews, because in my experience of reporting the situation of the reporters of Apple Daily, I think you really need some time to let things happen and maybe let the pain heal or not to be healed, and then you can get a bigger picture of how the people live under such a traumatic experience. Like we have a follow-up interview after 1 year of the shutting down of Apple Daily, and we interviewed several former Apple Daily reporters. Some of them were our interviewees before, and some of them were not. They told us the feeling come back on May and June. Like although it's already a year before, and they told us that the feelings came back. And I think the pain is real and it continues no matter they got a new job or a new life or what, because the court cases of their former colleagues are still ongoing, and some of their former colleagues left Hong Kong and they can't see each other anymore. And yeah, so I think in the experience, it just reminds me that the trauma not only exists in the most crucial time, but maybe throughout their lifetime. So as a reporter, I think follow-up interviews is quite important to get a bigger picture.
Very good reminder for all reporters. And then Yuan Ye and Margherita, you really had no time to take those breathers because it was so really breaking news on the spot. So what was your takeaway?
Well, I guess my takeaway was that in that situation, there was the common trauma of the country collapsing to the Taliban, but the way people experienced it varied immensely. So there were people who made it on planes out of the country. So it's the trauma of leaving your homeland and the kind of awareness that you're gonna have to start again somewhere else. People who were not able to leave the country. So the trauma of still trying to leave and surviving and not knowing. There was a great uncertainty. People did not know how the Taliban were going to behave towards those left behind, especially people who had close ties with with foreigners. And there was a trauma of people who tried to leave and they were caught in terrible episodes of violence. I spoke to one woman who, in a desperate attempt to leave the country, rushed to the airport, and there were gunshots fired, and her mother was killed in front of her, in front of the airport. Of course, there was also ISIS bombings outside the airport. So people experience really different types of trauma. And I would add that the trauma for Afghanistan is not over yet. I've been there many times since the Taliban takeover, and it's for women, it's a constant trauma. For especially for young women who went to school, who used to go to school, had dreams for the future. They can't go to school. Every day they're stuck at home. That's terribly painful. There's a huge hunger crisis. There's a economic crisis in Afghanistan. So the suffering hasn't ended yet. Some things were less bad than we thought they were going to be. The Taliban have not retaliated in such a broad scale as we had maybe expected. But then there's been other really painful developments, especially for women and poverty.
Okay, so like similarly in Zhengzhou, it's in the aftermath of a disaster, and many people lost their loved ones. So I think when we were there, it's clear that you can see that people need time to process their grief. So like what Margherita just said, it's like a common trauma there shared in those people. So you can like when you walk on the street there, you can feel that people there and people who went to mourn the dead ones in the flooded subway, they have this shared common trauma. So I think as a reporter, you have to respect the people who lost their loved ones, and you know that you have to be patient because they all need time to process their grief. And also when we were there and we as reporters, because we are also people, we are also human beings, we are kind of like maybe share this kind of significant. I think it's always better to know that you are not alone in fitness. You can talk and share with reporters, and those shared spirits can lift you up to a certain degree. So that's my experience.
Were there any interview techniques or specific lessons you can share with other reporters and how to conduct such interviews?
I think when a disaster happened, so the most important thing that matters is time, because you have to move fast and talk to people you're able to find as much as possible. So it's very important for me to write down the keynotes, like either it's on a notepad or it's on your cell phone, but you have to write down keynotes timely while you still can. Like not just the important information, but also the environment, the people, how they look, and how their voice were like, and how their face were like. So just to note down information, and otherwise, because you can very easy to forget the key points when you left.
So be like a sponge ball and absorb as much as you can on site. Any other tips on interviews, techniques for such situations?
Well, if I could say something, I mean, interviews can be very triggering for people who have had a traumatic experience, even if the traumatic experience hasn't happened that moment. When you ask them about it, people often, it's very common people will burst into tears when those interviews are happening. And I think it's absolutely okay. And in fact, it's, we should show, we should show empathy in that moment. You can take off your journalist hat and, and behave like a human would in front of a human who's experienced a lot of suffering. So, in that moment when they're also, letting their guard down, I think it's okay to embrace that and to show empathy, yeah, and maybe a pause reporting for a few minutes.
And so it's almost like you're two different people. There's the person who's on site to soak up everything and experience everything. And then there's the person who puts on the reporter hat later and puts these things into perspective and crafts the narrative and puts distance between yourself and the subjects. How do you balance all these roles?
I think you have, I mean, when you interview someone, they have to know why you're interviewing them. I think often, especially in situations of, say, natural disasters or people are very desperate, they think that maybe that will lead to some immediate help. So I think you have to be very clear about why you're talking to them, that this is not going to necessarily translate into like, you know, material help or people won't necessarily know about you and intervene. So you have to be clear about why you're interviewing people. But then also, yes, you have to, you know, you report what you see, but you know, in a moment of suffering, I think you take a short break and then you go back to reporting. So yeah, I think it becomes naturally as, you know, as we just speak to people. I think it doesn't require any particular. I think you just kind of go with the flow. You know, if you feel like someone needs a moment to collect themselves, then give them that moment, give them a comforting word, and then go back to reporting. And of course, it's, you know, that often makes stories even better. But of course, we don't want to be in a situation where we're like exploiting people suffering for our stories. So I think it's about being sensible and having the right kind of sensitivity towards people who have suffered a lot. And there's often the temptation as reporters to be like, I have a situation where, like, you know, I meet, for example, women who've lost everything, and you know, my temptation would be like, oh, you know, if it were completely up to me, I'd give them all the money I have in my wallet and, you know, organize fundraisers. But I think you have to be a bit more strict about that. You can't blur the lines between reporting and aid. Of course, yeah, I think you absolutely can show empathy, but people should be clear about why you're talking to them. And as tempting as it is to try to like immediately, you know, provide, you know, a material support to people, you have to be a bit careful about doing that. It's many news organizations like mine don't allow that, for example. But it doesn't mean that, you know, it can still, bringing attention to their plight can still help them in other ways. Others can reach out to them, and that's something we've experienced over and over again, where we write about someone and then others want to help them, and then we connect them, and so there's ways of helping them, which doesn't necessarily complicate the relationship between a reporter and the person being interviewed.
Yeah, that's a really good point about setting the ground rules and being transparent about the reasons that you're interviewing them. Anyone else want to share any thoughts on this issue? If not, I have one other question, which is that when I read your stories, most of them are based on joint efforts working with other reporters. And it seems like a very common thing these days in newsrooms, where when you're trying to cover these big stories that are fast developing, you often have to work with other reporters. Do you have any tips to share in terms of how to collaborate with colleagues in the newsroom?
Okay, I can start answering that, and then someone else can take over. I guess it's we do it in different ways, but it's always helpful to have one person who's more in charge than the others, who can help kind of direct what kind of reporting we need. You don't want to be all doing the same reporting, so it's good to have one person, whether it's an editor or another reporter, who you know knows what they're getting and on what else they need, and so you have a clear division of labor. I think that helps, and of course having a conversation about it together at the beginning also helps. So yeah, I think that would be, you know, you want to complement each other's reporting. You know, you don't want to all be doing the same work.
Are there any other thoughts on this?
I can share something. I think likewise complement each other's work is very important, because like when you have to know that it's not your own work, it's a teamwork. So your colleagues are very important to support you. So like when we were reporting on the Zhengzhou floods, while we were out there in the field, there are colleagues who are dutifully doing desk research in the office, collecting online materials. And also we have editors to help you put things into perspective. So each of our work are very important, and I think mutual respect and to communication and shared understanding are all very necessary to ensure that the teamwork is great.
Yeah, that respect, mutual respect and trust is really important. So as a final question for all of you, I'm curious to know what you hope public readers, what the takeaway they should be having after reading your stories, and what do you hope to evoke in readers? Start with Fu-Nien.
I had discussed this issue with my coworker, Yuan, and her message is we can't find a standard answer for life and death issues, so we try to give various and diverse perspectives to the readers, and they can think about the issue together and have their own opinions and about how we can improve the distribution of resources to prevent such tragedy, dilemma to happen again. As for me, actually, I felt very complicated when the SOPA award announced, because this honor is based on so many people's families suffer sadness and trauma. However, thank you for your recognition and that this issue be seen again, and hope the public and the government can reflect on it and show that history itself.
Moving on, Kwan Lee.
Yeah, maybe I can share some, because I think the complicated thing is that we got the news that we won the award during a conversation with an Apple Daily reporter on a follow-up interview, and she just got a new job and she didn't forget the pain. She just burst into tears soon after we met, and I got the news that we got the award, and I always think about the meaning of the article winning the award. I believe the meaning of the story is to document the first thoughts of the reporters in such a political trauma, and most of them told us that their first reaction when they knew that their company is going to shut down, their first reaction is to write, to shoot, and to publish. And so actually, Apple Daily is the media who is good at breaking news, and they can't participate in the award anymore. And yeah, so that's what I'm talking about, that I have been thinking about the meaning of we winning the award. And it's a really complicated feeling. But at the end, I think it's not only about us, but about the media landscape changing in Hong Kong. And so we have to believe documentary in such a historical moment is important. And if we are in faith that these records can lead to more attention and more thinking in this stage of turmoil in Hong Kong, and I think that will be the most important influence of the stories to the readers.
Before we move on to our other two speakers to share their thoughts, I just wanted to remind everyone on the call that you can raise any questions you have in the chat box on the right. Yuan Ye, what are your takeaways from what you hope readers take away from your story?
Well, I have been thought about the question. I have been thinking about this question for quite some time. And then I think when a disaster happened, it's for the people who were going through all of this. Is it really? Sometimes I ask myself whether is it really good to ask people about their traumatic memories, and to ask people about what their lost ones, how they lost their loved ones, and what things were like when they were going difficult times. So and I think my experience reporting about the Zhengzhou floods just taught me something about I think the value of documenting important things, because we as an individual, we share we had traumatic times and we have had our difficult times. But it carries a lot of more value when it gets documented and it fits into a larger perspective and social context. When things like this happen, and when the next disaster happen, they are all like kind of very important materials to either to provide some historical value or to provide important information for people to remember. So I think that's my takeaway. It's about my own experience when when going through traumatic times.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And documenting these experiences and events is why a lot of us got into the profession in the first place, because we realized the importance. Margherita, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, my main takeaway would be, breaking news is not, it's often the beginning of a story. So while it draws our attention, it should also be, whatever's happened, for example, what happened in Afghanistan deserves our attention, still deserves our attention. And Afghans, whether they manage to leave the country or stay in the country, deserve our attention and our help. So I think breaking news can be a way to broaden interest in whatever's happening. I think Afghanistan definitely deserves that, and we did that. That was the beginning. I mean, we've been covering Afghanistan for many years before that, but we kept covering Afghanistan after the takeover as much as we could, and we're still able to travel there, and we still do. And then, of course, it's hard to be optimistic when something like this happens. So on a personal level, I would say it's kind of a reality check. It makes it harder for me and for people who've witnessed that to take anything for granted. We know so many Afghans who grew up with expectations of living in a democracy, with women who thought they could study, they could go to work. All that's gone. So it shows really how fragile some of what we take for granted can be, including basic things in our lives. So I think it's been an important reality check.
Yeah, the experience definitely can be humbling. And I think your point on after covering breaking news, you don't just forget about the story, you go and revisit the story as it continues to develop, and you don't forget about the people and the events that really led you to the covering that breaking news story. That's all the time we have today for our session, and thank you for attending our panel. Big thanks to all our panelists for sharing, and for more information, you can follow at SOPA Asia on Twitter and on the website sopaasia.com and sopaawards.com. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.